From murderous doctors who used their status to inflict untold numbers of fatalities across innocent populations, to real-life modern vampires that were much scarier than anything Bram Stoker ever could have conjured up. Are you sure you're ready to brave our picks for 5 real serial killers that deserve their own horror movies? Number 5. Pedro Lopez, the Monster of the Andes. Pedro Lopez, or more infamously the Monster of the Andes, is a modern-day prolific Colombian serial killer who operated across Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, racking up a kill list of 110 known victims, though by some claims and accounts, that number could actually sit closer to 300 or so. Historically, Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in the municipality of Venadillo, Tolima, in Colombia in 1948, and was the 7th of 13 children. Due to his single mother's profession as a working girl, his household was wrought with violence and trauma, and at just 9 years of age, Pedro was banished from the property when his mother caught him attempting to assault his sister. For a time, Lopez would wander the streets and was sexually abused himself. Slowly, he would work his way up to petty crime, and in 1969, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for auto theft. During Pedro's stint in the slammer, he was brutally assaulted by 4 other inmates, and it's documented that days later, he would hunt down and kill these inmates one by one in retaliation. In 1978, the Monster of the Andes was released from prison, after which he would wander the northwestern region of South America and would eventually arrive in Peru. Notably, Lopez would later claim that during this period he would have murdered around 100 girls, namely street children and those who had wandered too far from their indigenous tribes. And while these claims ultimately remain unverified, it is known that Pedro was captured for a time by an Ayacuchoan tribe after attempting to abduct a 9-year-old girl. Pedro would be held by this tribe until an American missionary convinced them to turn the killer over to the police, after which Lopez was deported from Peru and would continue to travel South America in search of future prey. It was during this period that authorities in various South American locales began noticing an increase in missing persons, namely in young women. And following an incident in April of 1980, when flooding of Ambato, Ecuador unearthed the decaying remains of a handful of girls who'd previously been reported missing, authorities realized they had to act. Subsequently, a series of cases were reopened, and shortly after the flooding, the botched abduction of 12-year-old Marie Poveda, who was with her mother Carvina at the time, would result in the monster literally being overpowered by local merchants, who were able to restrain him until the police arrived. Following his second arrest, Lopez would confess his crimes to one police captain, Pastor Cordova, who, in a ruse, was placed in the same cell as Lopez while posing as a fellow prisoner. During his confession, the monster would boast that in total, he'd estimated he'd killed over 200 people in Ecuador, some tens more in Peru, and many others in Colombia, and that his favorite ritual of attack was luring his victims away from crowds by using small trinkets, before assaulting and then strangling them to death with his bare hands. To make matters even more disturbing, he also admitted to later digging the bodies of his victims up from their burial sites, in order to, get this, have tea parties with them. Shortly after his confessions, Pedro would direct authorities to the bodies of 53 victims, and a total of 110 kills were confirmed in Ecuador. And later, in 1980, Lopez was convicted of murder and was sentenced to Ecuador's maximum 16-year prison term. In 1998, the Monster of the Andes was released, preceding which, surprise surprise, bodies once again started sprouting up and more people started going missing. To date, Pedro, who would be in his 70s now, has never been captured, and the monster's whereabouts remain a mystery. Number 4. Harold Shipman, Dr. Death. From 1971 to 1998, Harold Frederick Shipman, or Fred to acquaintances, was an English general practitioner and serial killer that today, and at around 250 known victims during his time as Dr. Death, is widely considered to be one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Historically, Shipman was born in Nottingham in 1946 as the middle child of 3, and to devout Methodist working-class parents. Through his youth, Harold was especially fond of his mother, and in 1963, when she passed on to lung cancer, his 17-year-old world was shattered. Notably, in the later stages of her disease, Shipman's mother was dripped high levels of morphine courtesy of an at-home doctor, and this act is widely considered a catalyst for his future means of disposing of his victims, but more on that in just a minute. On November 5th of 1966, Harold would marry one Primrose May Oxtoby. Together, the couple would welcome 4 children into the world, and eventually, Shipman would begin studying medicine through the Leeds School of Medicine, University of Leeds, from which he would graduate in 1970. In 1971, our good doctor would officially begin practicing medicine. In 1974, he would take up his first position as a general practitioner at Hyde. Through the 1980s, Shipman would maintain his position and work, and in 1993, he would establish his own surgery at 21 Market Street as a respected member of the community with a number of local ties. But it wouldn't be long before things took a drastic turn for the worse, when in March of 1998, those paying attention began questioning Shipman's practice's exceedingly high death rate, and in particular, the ridiculously large number of cremation forms he held for elderly women that had needed countersigned. While an investigation did ensue, by the 17th of April, when no solid evidence had been uncovered, police were forced to close the case, after which, it's believed Dr. Death killed another 3 victims in short succession. A few months later, through August of the same year, taxi driver John Shaw would contact local police and would inform them of his growing suspicions of Shipman after no less than 21 patients who he'd personally dropped off there and who'd seemed in immaculate health prior died spontaneously while under the doctor's care. Ultimately, Shipman's last victim and the kill which would end his run was the slaying of 81-year-old former Hyde Mayor Kathleen Grundy, who was discovered deceased within her home on June 24th of 1998, and whom, despite her advanced age, was fit and healthy. Incidentally, Shipman was the last person to see Grundy alive, and the ex-mayor's daughter would become concerned when she found her mother's will had been modified to exclude the family entirely and instead to leave £386,000 to Dr. Death's practice. Subsequent investigations of Grundy's body would yield traces of diamorphine, or basically heroin, which, at the time, was used to treat chronic pain in terminal cancer patients. Harold was finally arrested on September 7th of the same year, with investigations concluding the doctor had been administering lethal doses of his choice opiate to patients, forging their death certificates, and falsifying medical records to profit while simultaneously covering his tracks. And on January 31st of the year 2000, following 6 days of trial, a jury would find Shipman guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, though as stated previously, it's now estimated by many that his total kills may have ranged upwards of 250. On January 13th of 2004, Dr. Death would meet his own fate at the age of 57, when it was discovered the dread surgeon had hanged himself inside of his cell at His Majesty's Prison, Wakefield. Number 3. Robert Hansen, the Butcher Baker. Standing as probably the most well-recognized and iconic murderer amongst our US viewers that we've chosen to feature on this list today, Robert Christian Boaz Hansen, or the Butcher Baker, was an American serial killer who operated in and around Anchorage, Alaska from 1971 to 1983, and whose primary ritual included abducting young women, taking them to his home or to a remote cabin, assaulting them, and then releasing them to be hunted like game. All in all, it's believed that at least 17 women met this horrifyingly disturbing fate. Historically, Robert was born in 1939 in Iowa as the elder of 2 children under his American mother and Danish father, who owned a bakery. When Hansen came of age, his father would employ him at the family bakery, and while this may seem like a pretty sweet setup for a successful life, and while a majority of serial killers we've covered experience some form of family trauma, Robert's demons were created through his shy nature, his stutter, and a severe case of acne, which actually left him permanently scarred, attributes he was constantly ashamed of. Subsequently, he would get zero attention from the girls he was interested in, resulting in a growing resentment and in Robert forming dark fantasies of wrath and revenge. As he matured, Hansen would begin practicing both hunting and archery. In 1957, he would enlist in the U.S. Army Reserve, which he would only serve in for 1 year before being discharged, and for a time, he would act as an instructor at the police academy in Pocahontas, Iowa, where he would even meet a younger woman whom he would marry through the summer of 1960. But things were about to take a drastic change when, on December 7th of the same year, Robert was arrested for burning down a Pocahontas County Board of Education school bus garage as an act of vengeance over his unpopularity in high school, landing him 20 months of a 3-year prison sentence in Anamosa State Pen, and during which time he was diagnosed with manic depression and periodic schizophrenic episodes. It was at this point that Hansen's first wife would file for divorce. Over the following years, Hansen would be jailed several times for petty crimes. In 1963, he would marry a second time to one Darla Henriksen, with whom he would have 2 children, and in 1967, the family would move to Anchorage, where they were respected and well-liked by their neighbors and community members, and where Robert actually held several hunting records. It's believed Hansen would start killing around 1972, when he would abduct young women, namely working girls, and would take them to secluded areas or to his house when his family was away, where he would then first assault and then later hunt them down as if they were wild game, before finishing them off with his gun or with a knife. In total, while he admitted to 17, some now believe Hansen may have claimed upwards of 30 victims, ranging in age from 16 to 41, and of these murders, he would only face charges on 4 counts. But things would finally come to an end for the butcher baker after over a decade of killing when, on June 13th of 1983, he abducted the wrong woman, one 17-year-old Cindy Paulson, who he kidnapped at gunpoint and held in his basement before attempting to drive her to the airport, where she most assuredly would have been forced into his private plane and out to his infamous hunting cabin, to share in a ghastly fate already experienced by so many. A survivor, however, Cindy managed to slip his car when it had slowed sufficiently, and escaped to the road on foot, where she flagged down a trucker and was taken to the Mush Inn. Incidentally, Cindy had even had the presence of mind to leave behind her blue sneakers on the floor of Hansen's car to prove to authorities that she'd been there. And before too long, and after some investigation, the notorious killer was apprehended, with the kidnapping and sexual assault of Cindy Paulson topping his list of charges. In court, Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole, and would die there on August 21st of 2014 at the age of 75 from lingering health conditions coupled with natural causes, effectively ending the butcher baker's reign of terror. Number 2. Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. Richard Trenton Chase was an American serial killer and necrophile recognized for murdering 6 people in the span of a month from late 1977 to early 78, who was dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento due to the fact that he drank his victims' blood and often cannibalized their remains. Historically, Chase, who was born in 1950, was raised in a strict household and was beaten often by his father. Through his teenage years, he would grow into a strong alcoholic and would also begin displaying a fondness for killing and mutilating bugs and small animals and for fire starting, both of which that are pretty much common traits in the budding serial killer's handbook. As he matured, Richard would develop hypochondria and would often complain that his heart would stop beating or that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery, and would even hold oranges to his head, believing that their vitamin C could be absorbed by his brain by way of diffusion. Notably, Richard would also keep his head shaved so he could view his scalp, as he believed his cranial bones had become separated and were moving around. As an adult, Chase would move back in with his mother. However, this stint wouldn't last too long, as he would soon begin accusing her of trying to poison him, resulting in his father purchasing an apartment for him, namely to keep him at a distance. However, this was the last thing the Vampire of Sacramento needed, and left to his own devices, he would begin to capture, kill, and disembowel a number of animals and small pets, many of which that he'd consume raw. Eventually, Chase even upped his game and started making entrail smoothies, which he fully believed would keep his heart from shrinking and him from dying. In 1975, Chase was involuntarily committed to a mental institution following an incident in which he injected rabbit's blood into his own veins and contracted blood poisoning, and during his stay, staff would begin referring to him as Dracula, following the discovery that Richard had actually captured 2 birds through the bars of his room, had snapped their necks, and had sucked their blood out. Following a slew of treatments and psychotropic drugs, Chase was deemed no longer a danger to society, and by 1976, he would be released into the care of his parents, preceding which his misguided mother would actually wean him off of his anti-schizophrenic medication, under the deluded belief that there really wasn't anything wrong with her son. After a short while, his parents would again procure an apartment space for Richard, and on his own, he'd again start capturing and torturing neighborhood cats, rabbits, and dogs, before killing them and drinking their blood. Like any true creature of the night, however, eventually, animals wouldn't cut it for the Vampire of Sacramento, and on December 29th of 1977, he would move up to murder when he killed his first human victim in a drive-by, a slaying that would stand as the opening act in his month-long spree of terror. This victim was 51-year-old engineer and father of two Ambrose Griffin, who, at the time of the shooting, was simply helping his wife bring the groceries into their home. Chase would strike again on January 21st of 1978 when he entered the residence of David and Teresa Wallen and murdered a pregnant Teresa who was home alone at the time, before desecrating her body in ways deemed unimaginable. Chase's final murder, which also actually qualified as a mass murder, would transpire on January 27th when he entered the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Myroth, who was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew David, and who was also accompanied by her 6-year-old son Jason and by Dan Meredith, a neighbor who'd swung in to say hi. Chillingly, Richard would systematically shoot each person present at the time before desecrating their bodies, and when police arrived at the scene, they would find perfect hand and footprints in Evelyn's blood. Following this tragedy by days, the police would set to work on tracking down their suspected vampire, after which, upon arresting Chase and searching his apartment, they would discover more than enough evidence in their theory's favor. On May 8th of the same year, Richard was found guilty by trial and was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, appropriately warranting him the death sentence, a sentence he managed to avoid when, on December 26th of 1980, the vampire of Sacramento was found dead within his cell, having overdosed on antidepressants. Number 1. The Axeman of New Orleans. Coming in as easily one of the most chilling murderers on our list, the Axeman of New Orleans was actually an unidentified serial killer who operated in the city of their namesake and surrounding communities from May of 1918 through October of 1919, and whose identity, to date, remains a total and complete mystery. As this anonymous killer's name implies, the Axeman's victims were usually killed with, you guessed it, an axe, and normally one that the victim kept themselves, and that was acquired by the killer at the scene. In all of the Axeman slayings, no motive was ever discovered, and all of the victims' belongings were found intact and undisturbed. The Axeman's first murders would transpire on May 23rd of 1918, when the home of Italian grocer Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine was broken into, after which the perpetrator would make his way back to the couple's bedroom, where, while they were sleeping, he would slit their throats with a straight razor, before bashing their heads in with an axe. And you thought your alarm clock was bad. Next on the chopping block was Louis Bessemer and his mistress Harriet Lowe, who were attacked on June 27th of the same year in the back of his grocery shop, where they were both stricken in the head with a hatchet. Though this couple would survive the initial assault, sadly, Lowe would later die during surgery to repair her wounds. One of the more insane accounts of an Axeman attack transpired in the early morning hours of August 5th, when a pregnant 28-year-old Anna Schneider recounts waking to find a dark figure standing over her bed, who proceeded to bash her face repeatedly and left her for dead. Anna's husband would arrive home from work later, and instead of panicking, would waste no time rushing his mortally wounded wife to the hospital, where, against all odds, she survived and, even more miraculously, managed to give birth to a completely healthy baby girl just 2 days later. 5 days following the Schneider attack, on August 10th, Pauline and Mary Bruno, who lived with their uncle Joseph Romano, would awaken to the sounds of a violent commotion in the adjoining room. When they entered, they discovered Romano had taken several serious blows to the head, and while he managed to walk himself to the ambulance when it arrived, he would end up dying just 2 days later from his wounds. The Axeman would strike again on March 10th of 1919 when screams were heard emanating from the Cortimiglia residence in Gretna by neighbors and by those passing. Disturbingly, when one such neighbor finally worked up the courage to enter the house, they would discover the head of the household, Charles, lying on the ground in a pool of his own blood, and his wife, Rosie, who herself bore a grievous head wound, supporting herself in the doorway while clutching the expired body of their daughter, Mary. While Charles and Rosie would survive, ultimately their lives were left shattered, and it's documented that they were never really again the same. Notably, on March 13th, just 3 days later, a supposed letter from the Axeman was published in several newspapers, with the writer claiming they'd kill again at 15 minutes past midnight on March the 19th, but would spare potential victims in places where jazz music was playing. That night, dance halls, studios, and stages would fill to capacity, and nearly every household would host a party, and while at first many believed this letter a hoax or the working of party-hungry youth, strangely, not a single murder would transpire on the 19th. While things were quiet for a time, later in 1919, on August 10th, one grocer, Steve Boca, was attacked in his bedroom in typical Axeman fashion. However, he would end up surviving the assault, and on September 3rd, 19-year-old Sarah Lauman would also face the Axeman, and was discovered at her residence lying unresponsive in her bed, missing several teeth and suffering from a severe head trauma, though she would also surprisingly recover. Finally, through the night of October 27th of 1919, Mike Pepitoni's wife would awaken to a sharp sound next to her and would find her husband's head had literally been splattered across their entire room. Incidentally, this explosive finish would mark the last of the known Axeman murders, with the mysterious spree concluding just as quickly as it had started. To date, the Axeman's identity remains a mystery, and though a range of theories have been proposed over the years, from lone psychopaths to organized hits carried out under the guise of the iconic murderer, in reality, sadly, we'll probably never get the whole truth. Thanks for tuning in for this list of 5 real serial killers that deserve their own horror movies. If you enjoyed hearing our histories and tales of terror, subscribe to our channel, like this upload, and share us with anyone you feel could use a good scare. We'll catch you all next time, if someone else doesn't first.